and Naciremas, not only as jesters, but also as chroniclers and executors of the status quo of a discipline which is monarchical by nature. As every court, the court of the Naeporeus and the Naciremas contain a good degree of historiographical flippancy, and it is cemented on a set of institutions, tools, and practices. Among these institutions, we can, of course, mention the Western Ecumenic Church, the OECD, the NATO, the Institute for Scientific Information, and the fan club of Springer and Elsevier. The court of the Naeporeus and the Naciremas has a unique language, the langue deux, for reasons of convenience, and because this is also the exclusive language in this festival, I will call it English with a capital E. But you can also call it Español, Esperanto, or whatever you like. From now on, when I refer to English, I refer to English. Well, I stop now my broadcasting anthropological impersonation, which makes reference to my title, this Naciremas and this Naeporeus. You can think about it. And I take the occasion to congratulate the organizers of this festival. My focus on language in this brief and therefore inevitably sketchy talk considers what anyone knows pretty well, that language is not just language. It involves culture, national and regional identities, cognition, and communication. And these are just a few fundamental elements, not only for our profession, but for our social lives in general. As history of science does not reside in an ivory tower, and some people rather think that it resides in a Babel tower, for instance, this is particularly relevant to reflect on the past, present, and future of our field. A few colleagues have reflected on the multilingual practice of science in historical perspective. You can see here some early journals of the history of science. Archeion, which was published in Italy since the 1910s and then moved to Argentina. ISIS, you can see a summary of its first issue, where you can see how Archeion and ISIS in its first decades publish articles in at least in several European languages, Spanish, Italian, French, English, German. Another example is the Revue d'Histoire des Sciences et de leurs Applications, one of the oldest journals in our field as well, which had, however, a different approach since its beginnings and preserved it for most of its life. It is still published, which was to publish only in one language, in French. For the case of Archeion, it kept publishing in many different languages, European languages, or several of them. In the case of ISIS, it maintained this practice for its first decade, but once it moved to the United States, it ended up publishing only in English. On the far right side of the screen, you can see Ciencia, which was not a history of science journal, but was a science journal published in Mexico, which had many papers, or a good number of papers in history of science. And like the French Revue d'Histoire des Sciences, only published mainly in one language, in this case, Spanish. A few colleagues, as I was saying, a few colleagues have reflected on the multilingual practice of science in historical perspective. I can mention, for instance, Jan Schurman, Beatriz Gutiérrez, Michael Gordin, Renat Ortiz, or Adriana Minor, among many others. You can see here also a very good paper by Nakayama Shigeru, published in Osiris in 1995, which reflected on how, in order to make history of science in regional perspective in Asia, it was particularly important to master several Asian languages, and how there was a good amount of literature which was perhaps not enough knowledgeable and of languages, Asian languages, and for this reason had certain biases on the East. It is, as I say, well, in counterpoint to what Shigeru was saying, more recently, another Japanese colleague, Yoshi Kikuchi, wrote a paper, if I'm not wrong, where he was arguing how English had been particularly useful in order to connect Asian historians of science across different national states. No? So we can see, obviously, we are here in this festival, and the fact that we all speak English is particularly useful, and this happens with any lingua franca in the history of humanity. What I would like to pinpoint here is that the question is not speaking or reading or listening to one language or another, but the important thing will be to have a much larger plurality in the sense of mastering or being able to deal with at least several languages. And this is something that historians of science perhaps have not reflected enough. Because, as I will argue, this had also impacts in how history of science is practiced. One of the scholars who have reflected in a very honest and interesting way about this is Michael Gordon in this book, which is very well known, Scientific Babel. And in the introduction, he makes a very honest and open statement about the limitations of knowing. Just in his case, he can read in a good number of languages, but there's still not been enough, and his conclusions being shaped by the capacity of reading in certain languages and not in others. No? But after this apologetical introduction, which, as I say, is very valuable, but maybe he forgets a little bit, and the rest of the book is perhaps too conformist about the situation. Still, Michael Gordon tells us about the fact that if the community of science was multilingual in the past, maybe it could be again thus in the future. No? So here we are thinking about the future of the history of science, and this might be a future too. I show you here two graphs. On the left, you see the graph that appears in Michael Gordon's introduction. On the right is his source. He takes this graph from a different from a paper, but the legend of his graph doesn't doesn't state that, well, this data that show you how publication in different languages in science has evolved across time. Well, it is based on certain databases. No, you can see biological abstract, chemical abstracts, mathematical abstracts, physics abstracts, etc., etc. No? Gordon explains and discusses this subsequently in his book, but I have seen authors that cite this graph at face value as something that is a reality, and without taking into account that this is based on particular databases which are particularly biased. No? And here I want to raise these items, no, that I show here, you know, the need of reflexivity, thinking about our sources, thinking that methodological nationalism is present in our daily practice because we live in nation states. So this is something we cannot avoid, and we have particular trainings and cultures, etc. And that we don't have to confuse the global with the universal, no? Something that, in principle, history of science already abandoned a long time ago, no? Universality, but it is not the case on how things go very often, no? If you see other type of sources, such as those compiled by UNESCO in a world list of periodicals and a database called DHST, you can see that the Science Citation Index is a very poor representation of social science journals in the world, especially in those countries that publish journals which are not published in English. No, so it is not a very trustable source in order to make quantitative analysis. No. I want to talk about how this can impact on scholarship, no? And I'm going to focus more on the book that you can see on your right, but I will say also something about these other two the book, The Broker Wall, and also this paper on transnational history, which has been particularly influential and is very much cited. What happens here is that, for instance, The Broker Wall is a fantastic contribution, not to our field, but it is a contribution that is based on scholars that use only, in general, most scholars in this book use, they build their methodological approach using exclusively sources written in English. No? And also there are many chapters that present histories of Eastern countries that are based, or histories on remote countries, exotic countries, I will say, that are based on colonial archives in large European or American cities. No, so you will have contributions talking about a vision of Japan, the science in Japan, but based exclusively, for instance, on sources available in Amsterdam, and written in Dutch or written in English, And this is something we should discuss. At the same time, the transnational proposal presented by Turchetti, Herrán, and Boudia is a proposal that focus exclusively or mainly in studying international organizations, And international organizations, by definition, are not directly transnational. There can be transnationalism in these organizations, but in general, they are international. They represent nationals of different places that discuss between them. Finally, how knowledge moves, written the transnational science, history of science and technology. Well, you can see that this book, as many books published by Chicago University Press lately, it doesn't indicate a place. It happens everywhere. It's universal. I mean, but this book deals mainly with American case studies and case studies in other places, Mexico, Brazil, Uruguay, but that show the American hegemony in the 20th century, which is something historically relevant and important, how US science and philanthropy arrived to many places. Okay, let me go forward. And in this sense, I have illustrated this with these sentences from the afterword of the book. One of our colleagues, which produces a very interesting work on mathematics, in the US, in the Uruguay, and in different places. Well, he tells us about this international experience connected to writing the book. And I can understand that the community of Anglo speakers is really the most global community currently. But my question will be if the most international set of scholars will be found in a situation like this. What if we had instead a set of historians of science from Thailand, from Angola, from Morocco, from Iceland that will meet in a Canadian restaurant in Lima, Peru, and will be served by a US waiter? Will this be so international or so transnational, or will it be less international or transnational? We need to think about other perspectives. Well, I think I'm going perhaps over time, or I'm taking a lot of time, and I would like just to raise these questions, or make it deeper, the approach of thinking that using being monolingual or using different languages and being used to different cultures allows you to build perspectives where there is a much greater balance that we could call international, transnational, or will be able to produce global pictures. But this is not something I believe that we can manage just with one language, with a lingua franca, with global English, for instance, which is relatively global. It covers a wide part of the world, but not the whole world. And instead, I think that we should advocate for pluralism, linguistic pluralism, historiographical pluralism, and methodological pluralism. And they are all connected. We cannot really separate them because language is part of how we build knowledge. I throw here just a few ideas. This is about history, memory, and imagination, and about the politics of representation. But I close my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We start provocative. That's what I like. And we've already got questions. So if the audience out there could keep putting those questions in as they come to mind, that'll be great. And we'll take them at the end. But we need to keep moving. So we move on to Gordon McOuat, who is from the University of King's College, Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, and is nominated by Canada, and his paper is titled Universal and Local Knowledge, Future Prospects. So Gordon, take it away.
Just thumbs up if you can see my screen, all right?
We can see your screen and I can hear you loud and clear.
Good on you. Well, thanks to the DHST. This is the penultimate session, and I'm wondering if anybody made it through the whole lot. I think I did, and they must be exhausted by now. Also, Joseph, thanks for ending on a Canadian note, especially a restaurant on the prairie serving Thai. I am speaking from Eastern Canada, which is the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Indigenous people. Now, our national organization in Canada, which nominated me, I guess, to this, is the Canadian Society for History and Philosophy of Science. And here our philosophers and historians get along somewhat. Perhaps we have Ian Hacking and our official multicultural federal policy to thank for that, but it certainly can be seen in various other places, including our history and philosophy of biology, which is very strong in Canada. But we've also had some success here in Canada at getting history and philosophy of science taken seriously by our federal funding agencies. And I want to speak to a couple of projects that have been funded by our federal government, and maybe how they might contribute to a discussion about the future of history of science, maybe history and philosophy of science. The two original big network clusters that were funded by a new funding program in Canada, one was some of you historians of the environment will know of the national or the niche, which is the network for environmental history. But the other one was quite unique. This, what you see on the screen here, Situating Science, which was a network for the humanities and social studies of science, included philosophers, historians, sociologists, but also a mess of people in political science and in science itself, creating a bunch of sub-networks on the communication across these borders to situate science both historically and philosophically. You can see some of the themes that we discussed there on the screen. Now, this project, which actually came up for an award nationally as being one of the most innovative projects, it's not to blow the horn about this, but it's a real success at being able to get multiple constituencies to be able to speak on various topics related to the history and philosophy of science. And we may, in the discussion, maybe we can talk a bit about that and how we did that. But one of the offshoots of this project was our international collaborations and the realization that, much like our prairie, we were still being rather parochial. In fact, the history of science had been rather Euro-Anglo-centric and parochial. And it was certainly manifested by the responses of the collaborations that we did internationally with places in Southeast Asia and China, etc., and eventually South America. So out of this project came a new project, which I'll talk a little bit about here, Cosmopolitan and the Local in Science and Nature. And it was this project coming out of the big Situating Science that began to look at these questions that Josep raised in his presentation a moment ago. We were taking, or are taking with this project, a stab at the big questions in globalized history and philosophy of science in collaboration with people outside of the global north, if you like, the usual suspects. And we're doing so within a critical landscape, of which you will all recognize this critical landscape that has been haunting around the edges of our field, coming in from all kinds of different directions, including the discussion of Orientalism and whether that's a good category, the rise and fall of center-periphery models in scientific distribution, ideas of decolonization, which is an official policy now of the Canadian government to decolonize knowledge through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Certainly the notions of historical ontology are also haunting our big project on cosmopolitanism. And the real big question of the idea of what it is to be modern and the multiple trajectories to what it is to be modern. And of course, right at the ground of this new project is the notion of provincializing Europe. And in it is my little hobby horse, the relationship between history of science and philosophy of science. Okay, we're centering, though, on a term that might be unfamiliar or at least uncomfortable with some of you, the notion of cosmopolitanism. It's certainly only peripherally discussed in the history of science and technology circles, but has been raised in earnest amongst political philosophers and literary philosophers, such as Anthony Appiah and Martha Nussbaum, Martha Sen. And they did so amid the growing worries about parochialism and rising populist nationalism. And so they presented an alternative of the notion of strong liberal cosmopolitanism, not internationalism, but cosmopolitanism. And so when we approached this category, we began to look as good historians, well, is it really an actor's category? Is there anybody that is a cosmopolitan, at least in the history of science? I mean, it might have something to do with taxes, but that's a different story. We certainly see the term coming up in work like Oliver Goldsmith's 1762, Citizen of the World, which uses the notion of cosmopolitanism and a cosmopolitan philosopher from China to actually criticize modernity and Europe. We really see this term rehearsed in an attack on modernity, such as that by Thomas Carlyle in his essay on Burns in Edinburgh Review. Don't need to read the whole thing here, but you can certainly see it starts off with pointing at cosmopolitanism, and it's taken the place of traditional knowledge. And you see below, he says, and what this has done. Any critical theorist in the continental tradition would recognize, oh, that's exactly what we say. Field of life shows neither briar or roses, but a flat, continuous thrashing floor for logic, wherein all questions from the doctrine of rent to natural history of religion are thrashed and sifted in the same mechanical impartiality. Now, so far, this project has organized a series of workshops and international collaborations and scholar exchange and summer schools in India, South India, workshops in Singapore, Edmonton, in Canada, etc. And I want to speak to just one of them that came up a few years ago, a remarkable workshop in the India Institute for Advanced Studies in Shimla, a workshop on cosmopolitanism and the history of science. We're working on getting it published right now. I love the irony here, though. That's the viceroy's, the last viceroy of England's or of India's house there, and we took it over for a week to discuss cosmopolitanism. Okay. It was organized by the incomparable Dhruv Rana from JNU in New Delhi. And there, in one of the sessions, I heard a remarkable paper by J. Lordasamy, who tried to summarize our work from the day on what is cosmopolitanism. I don't like definitions, but here's a couple anyway. And he seemed to nail something interesting on the head. Cosmopolitanism is a process or a state of a thing or person belonging to a place, with that belonging considerably informed by or allowed to its belonging to other places, times, and things. And cosmopolitanism is a process or state of a thing or a person being made to belong to a place, with that belonging considerably informed by or owed to its belonging to another place, times, and things. Now, note how that works tangentially or orthogonally to the notion of universalism and universal liberalism that's given to us by those like Nussbaum and Appiah, etc. Something else is going on here. the notion of cosmopolitanism being open to the stranger, a kind of hospitality, and most important, the corollary that it's against reduction to common meanings. We borrowed a bit from Gallison's trading zones, that there are sites, I guess, within which the comings together without being a common meaning. And that would be against the notion of moving towards a universal violence towards the local. So we are reimagining the local as open to strangeness and transportability, and especially the notion of cosmopolitan people and cosmopolitan objects. So in this project, we have been welcoming the rewriting of a global history against, as we will all carry this ticket, against center-periphery models, and maybe dropping some areas in network theory with a smidge of circulation of knowledge, but perhaps without the flat hegemony free ontology associated with that. And also keep in mind our reflexivity. Now, just as a plug at the end of my 1 minute, to that end, we are organizing an international conference for the next August here in Halifax, Canada, with collaboration from the BSHS, the HSS, the Needham Centers in Hong Kong and Cambridge, hopefully the International Union, to explore not just cosmopolitanism, but the circulation of knowledge. And we call it circulation of knowledge 20 years on, because that is 20 years to the month when we have this conference of Jim Secord's highly influential Knowledge in Transit paper, which he tells me is his most quoted publication. And there we're going to re-examine circulating of knowledge through 3 themes: research, looking at translations across, which Josep mentioned, how different sites are taking up translations of knowledge, and also for reforming the curriculum and creating textbooks. So I hope that you all will respond to our call for papers, which is available on the Cosmolocal conference website, but also will be distributed through the International Union. And that's my 10 cents. This is a wonderful network drawing from the great Japanese botanist Bunzo Hayata, who imagined ontological objects, including genes, as some kind of cosmopolitan network that were entirely perspectival. And I just love this picture. It's from 1921. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for reminding me how exciting 1820s Edinburgh was. Now, no global conference, no global festival should be global without really, or it can be truly global without visiting the poles. And so it's time with my great friend and colleague, Peder Roberts of the University of Stavanger, to take ourselves down as far as we can go to Antarctica for his paper, Antarctica, the Construction of a Continent by and for the History of Science. So Peder, take it away. The floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to talk to everyone today, this evening, this morning. And what I'd like to do is something that may on the surface seem a little odd, to ask whether the continent that has the fewest people in the world is in fact a continent constructed by and for the history of science. Is it a particularly interesting place to do the history of science? And can it tell us particularly interesting things about the history of science? I'll start with a very brief overview. Antarctica is a continent which is divided into slices, the largest being the Australian one on the right-hand side, the smallest being that little French blue one wedged in between, others claimed by Norway in lilac, New Zealand in green, and the 3 overlapping claims around the Antarctic Peninsula of Argentina, Britain, and Chile. These claims are frozen by the Antarctic Treaty of 1959, though not formally relinquished, and today the continent is governed by the Antarctic Treaty, which famously established the conditions for Antarctica to become the only place, I think, on Earth where scientists are the privileged actors. Simply put, scientists have more right to be in Antarctica and to conduct science than anyone else, or at least so the rhetoric goes. Now, why do I talk about a continent for peace and science? Well, that framing was there right from the start in 1959. It came right after the International Geophysical Year of 1957-58, and indeed the agreement that science could be conducted in Antarctica without causing direct sovereignty consequences during the IGY led, in many people's view, directly to the Antarctic Treaty a year later. I'm not going to go into why that's a little simplistic, but there is a good grain of truth in that. So already from 1959, the idea that Antarctica should be an arena for science was central. Military activities were strongly circumscribed, nuclear explosions banned. The continent should not be a scene of discord between the signatory states. In 1991, a protocol was signed on environmental protection, which quite literally said Antarctica should be designated a natural reserve devoted to peace and science. And what it really did here was to put down very bluntly something that had been really considered part of the ethos for over 30 years by then. So the idea that Antarctica is a peculiarly appropriate place for science, and indeed a place where science is the dominant form of activity, is something that is quite deeply rooted. The philosopher and sociologist of science, Arndt Elsinger, who I think will be known to many people participating in this seminar today, has done some remarkably good work, I think, in fleshing out exactly what it means in political terms to have a continent devoted to science. Arndt very famously argued that Antarctica had not only been constructed as a continent by science, that is, scientific knowledge fleshed out what the continent looked like in the past and indeed the present, but also that Antarctica had been constructed as a continent for science in political terms, a continent where the scientist was the dominant form of actor. And what he felt that meant, and I think he's right about this, is that essentially science becomes the vehicle through which politics is conducted, rather than the alternative to politics altogether. And that's the position that I think I'd like to start from here. So if we want to talk about a continent by and for the history of science, where can we go? I'd like to pose the obvious question to begin with. How much Antarctic history is then not the history of science? My dear doctoral advisor, Robert Proctor, once told me that he thought one of the best things about being a historian of science was it was very difficult for people to tell him that what he was doing was actually not really within the domain of history of science. It's a broad church, but the church is not infinitely broad. And in fact, I'd suggest there can be problems with applying a framing of Antarctica as the continent for science and thus the continent for history of science, because it precludes, or at least makes difficult to tell, certain forms of story. An example is the history of exploration. Again, many here will be familiar with the story of the brave Captain Robert Falcon Scott, who died along with 4 companions on the way back from the South Pole in 1912, having been beaten to his goal by the Norwegian Roald Amundsen. Scott was an explorer with his heart set on being first to the pole, but subsequently he became lionized as a martyr of science. The framing of Antarctica as a continent for science in turn shaped a way of telling the story of Captain Scott, in which his dedication to science, which was real, but probably not central to his identity, became his defining personal characteristic. This has led, I think, to a more pernicious tendency to evaluate the quality and the meaning, the value of subsequent expeditions in terms of their contributions to science or even their devotion to science. This is something that I think is quite problematic. Firstly, because it imposes, I think, a quite arbitrary yardstick on quite a wide variety of motivations for conducting Antarctic activity. But secondly, also because it presumes a cleavage between science and other forms of activity, implicitly less valuable, that I don't think really exists. Building a station at the South Pole, as the United States did in 1958, was a contribution to science, but also a strong statement of political intent in the midst of the Cold War. Both things can be true, And I think we can tell a story about Antarctic activity that involves science as a category a little bit more than just the aggregate of scientific knowledge. The risk, I think, therefore exists of a reduction to science versus anti-science narratives. If we want to talk about science as being the privileged form of activity in Antarctica, what then happens to other forms of activity that may have been regarded as valid at the time, be they simply attempting to get to the South Pole, be they scouting for potential natural resource exploitation, such as whaling? Are those activities implicitly to be regarded as outside the main line of Antarctic history? Do we impose particular framing that makes it difficult to tell those stories, or if we do tell them, to tell them in terms of how much they actually adhere to science and how much value they therefore had? The reason I think this is problematic is not just because it imposes an unjustified presentism upon the past, but also because it ignores the fact that, and I think again, Eltzinger was right here, science thus becomes politics by other means, in one sense. And I think this is important, not just because of the present day consensus, but also because for many actors, even within their own time, being able to say, well, we actually cared more about science was a way of establishing the superiority of a particular form of activity that may actually have been rather more complicated. And I'll give you a very quick example of 1929, when the Australian Douglas Mawson was busy racing against a Norwegian expedition led by Hjalmar Riise-Larsen to attempt to map territory on the coast of Antarctica. Riise-Larsen had connections to the Norwegian whaling industry, which was booming at the time. And one of the ways Mawson attempted to discredit his rivals was to say, look, they didn't actually care about science. They were just out after profit and whaling. And it wasn't just there are two different ways of seeing value in Antarctica. There is a better way and there is a worse way. Now, I'm not saying that whaling was better than science, far from it. What I am saying, however, is that if we choose to adopt categories of how closely did something adhere to science because science is the most appropriate thing to do in Antarctica, we end up making value judgments that I think must be acknowledged rather than taking adherence to science as a self-evident and unproblematic category. So I think we can also turn the question around. With apologies to John F. Kennedy, perhaps we should ask not what the history of science can do for Antarctica, but also what can Antarctica do for the history of science? One answer, I think, is that it pushes us to think about the relationships between the different components of scientific activity. This is not exactly rocket science. For 2 generations now, historians and particularly sociologists of science have argued that science is the outcome of a complex set of negotiations through which resources and power are assembled that allow science to take place. Antarctica is a peculiarly good place to see these processes in action. Antarctic science is expensive, it is difficult, and it can't just be done on a whim. Arguments must be made to raise the money and the political support for science to be conducted. Logistics must be assembled to allow fieldwork to be performed. In some cases, careers have to be shaped in such a way that going to Antarctica can appear to be not only a logical, but indeed a necessary activity. Gendered barriers to participation in Antarctic fieldwork still exist today and were impermeable until as late as the 1970s and 80s. I think there's a particularly interesting point to be made here about infrastructure. If you'll pardon me being corny, I do sometimes wonder whether infrastructure is the hidden 9/10 of the scientific iceberg. The ratio between scientists and support staff in Antarctica is probably not too much different to 1 in 10. Infrastructure is something that again takes time and money and capital and resources. Once a scientific station has been constructed in Antarctica, it obtains a form of inertia that almost requires scientific programs to be found in order to justify its continued existence. Were the station to close because scientists lost interest, it wouldn't just be a matter of well, look, it turned out not to be so interesting. We'll go somewhere else. Because science has this unique status in Antarctica, to close a scientific station is to relinquish a form of validated national activity. It is a political act to establish a station. It is a political act to allow a station to disappear. We see it also with supply to Antarctic fieldwork. Being able to build an airstrip, that's a thing that a lot of countries are very keen to do. Having an icebreaker that can perhaps get to places where other countries can't. Sweden has sometimes been inordinately proud of the fact that its icebreaker has been able to help United States scientists in some cases. Because scientific infrastructure and scientific activity are the forms of activity that guarantee participation in Antarctic decision-making, in a formal as well as an informal sense, infrastructure is political. To have infrastructure is to have a say. To not have infrastructure is to not do so in a voluntary way. This can lead to problems such as, is infrastructure redundant? I'll cite a very nice example I became aware of recently. Bulgaria has a station in Antarctica. Portugal does not. Portugal has an aircraft. Bulgaria does not. Portugal uses its aircraft to fly its researchers along with the Bulgarians to the Bulgarian station. And I know of at least one example where a Portuguese and a Bulgarian researcher who happened to be sitting next to each other found they had something in common and a research project eventuated. The infrastructure does not just facilitate the science, it frames the possibilities for the science, and its political character means that it can foreclose possibilities as well as ensure that national goals are written into them. As time is short, I'll leave the last question semi-hanging because it's too big, I think, to be answered in a short period of time anyway, and it's one that I think again stretches beyond Antarctica. The history of science has not always been aligned with what we might term environmental history. The history of science reveals the ways in which environments have been known, constructed, and also controlled. The history of science is not the history of environmental protection. It is the history of knowing environments for a variety of purposes, which could well encompass exploitation and degradation, as well as protection. The Environmental Protocol to the Antarctic Treaty of 1991 has established Antarctica as a very protected environment. Dogs are famously now banned from the continent. There are strict biosecurity measures. At the same time, mining is now also banned. Now, this doesn't mean that the continent for science just organically developed into the continent for environmental protection. That relationship between the two, I think, needs to be problematized and investigated further. And I wonder in how many other parts of the Earth, thinking critically about the relationship between the history of science and ways of conceiving environments as either worthy of protection or capable of exploitation, have developed and how they are negotiated. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you have a good evening or rest of the day.
Thanks, Peder. Do you want to just stop the share and then we'll move into the Q&A? Well, wow, 3 brilliant papers. I'm excited about this. We have had some questions in. They're all mostly directed towards the first speaker. So I'm going to ask the audience to be excellent and to give us some more questions, because I have been awake for 19 hours and my ability as chair to come up with questions is going to be limited. So Josep, I'm going to try and bring these together, and I know that you can see them, so if I fail. We have a question from and I want to give them all to you while people write questions for Gordon and Peder. And if Gordon and Peder want to come back onto these questions, you can do, because I think there is some overlap between the papers. So Anna Rodriguez asks, is in the past the community of science was multilingual ? I think the early modern period, the language of science was Latin and later on French. So do you want to comment on language, I think, there? Marcus has a similar question about language. So maybe we take the language first, then we'll move on to a middle question maybe about conferences and support. So Marcus Cueto asks, what advice would you give? And I would throw this out to all three of you. I think, Josep, you're a bit naughty to suggest about that transnational paper and language, because those three authors were writing in their second language. So it's an interesting observation to make. But Gordon, you operate in a multilingual country, and Peter, you speak many languages yourself, so you don't just work in English language sources. So maybe all of you can speak to this. What advice would you give to young historians of science living in non-English speaking countries in terms of a strategy for, I think, or of language of publication? So where do you want to start? I'm going to just throw it over to you.
I can try to be synthetic. Well, I mean, to Anna, of course, I mean, as I have shown with a few examples, I mean, the community not so long ago, or 1 century ago, historians of science and scientists, I mean, they were more plurilingual than currently in the international context, no? But this is also the context of many people in the world, no? In the daily life, no? As you mentioned, I mean, many people we live with different languages, and this is not that difficult. I mean, it's not, no one can master all languages, and then this comes to Melanie Frappier's question, no? How to manage a conference with different languages. It is possible that there is a tradition in other disciplines, for instance, in geography, in the history of geography, in the history of education. I mean, it has been more usual, no? There are languages like Italian, which is very, very important for the history of art, for instance, and still is, no? So this is relative, and it is possible to manage this. I mean, like the practical aspects, obviously, go through the fact that we all should, if we all speak English here, I mean, we should try to next year, no, to start to learn another language, no, just for fun, no. I mean, this will be good in many ways, no. And the fact that it's not only to speak, to master, but to be able to read, no, to take into account other sources. And this is also what I was saying about the transnational paper. I know the authors very well, and but their methodological approach is based on Anglo-American literature, and this is another thing. I mean, they could read other things and use them for good. And in terms of the question by Marco, it is a difficult question because it depends on how the world is built. And these some colleagues in the Anglo-American context have told me, but at least a long time ago, that science citation indexes were not so important. But in many countries, they are very important, and they direct jobs, promotions, funding for research projects, everything, no? So these rankings of journals is very important. So it's a difficult question because young scholars, they have to look for a solution in their lives. I will advise to publish in different places, and if possible in different countries and different languages, because it is more enriching. But obviously it is a difficult question. There are journals like, for instance, Manguinhos in Brazil, that Marcos knows very well, that try to produce different versions, even translations of the papers. No, not only abstracts, but also some papers can be read in Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And this is something that could also be done in many journals. I leave it there, so there is time for more discussion. Thank you.
Gordon, do you want to come in on that question of language?
Yeah, quickly. The one thing I didn't cover in 12 minutes was the notion that we get from Ativ Ghosh, the notion of vernacular cosmopolitanism. That is, in the local, even if there's something like an imposed language, it's always reworked in light of local conditions. And so, yes, we might have a lingua franca of English, but watch how each are beginning to translate in different ways in different sites. There is a worry, though, of the, and I quite get it, of the dominance of Anglo-American topics that have sat below the dominance of English, and that certainly has to change. Our conference, by the way, is going to have a whole section, whole day devoted to the issue of translation in the history of science. And this is something that hasn't really been focused on too much, and how concepts get translated into vernaculars and then back again. And so we're going to have a number of papers on that, hopefully, and a whole day and a workshop devoted to what we do with the translation in scientific texts. That's it.
Excellent. Peter, do you want to say anything on language, or I've got a question more specific to your paper?
I'll add very briefly on language. I agree, and I think in areas where the production of scientific knowledge is tied to the enactment of political goals, the language politics only become more important. I think we saw this in the Cold War, where the existence of a very strong Russian language literature was not just because there was lots of science done in the Soviet Union, but because having Russian as a viable scientific lingua franca was also an important marker of the strength of the Soviet Union as an ideological structure, and the way that Russian was used as a scientific language, not only in the Eastern Bloc, but also beyond. I'm surprised by the number of scientists in the US in the 60s who learned Russian at university because, well, you had to read Russian papers, didn't you? Wasn't very many, but it was a few. So that aspect, I think is important, and I do wonder if we tried to tie. Look, this is a very crude thing to say, but if there's some way of linking the popularity of a particular language as a form of a scientific lingua franca to the dominance of particular political ideologies or political systems, hegemonies even. I think that the Russian example is a good one. The fact that the internet speaks English, I suspect, is important too. Going to be really interesting to see what happens with Chinese.
Right. Do you want to quickly come back on that, Josep, and then I want to move on to a different topic.
Yeah. Just to say that I agree, but it is not just about the Russians or the Americans, or any lingua franca. It doesn't become a lingua franca naturally. There is work to be done, no, and this happened also with English after World War II, no, and there are something that, for instance, Adriana Minor, scholar from Mexico, has studied and published a paper about. Is how the US tried to convince Latin American scientists to publish in their journals when they were not hegemonical, and to derive them from publishing in German or French journals. No? And this happens, and obviously it's a complex phenomenon. No, also, but there is nothing essential about it, and obviously it involves work, and this might happen with English, with Spanish, with French, with any language that want to be a lingua franca or a interlingua. No.
Okay, I'm going to slightly take us in a different direction. It's time to go to the cold continent, so I think this is mostly going to be directed at you, Peter. But I'm going to try and branch it out to some of the a little bit. So both Lisa Winters and Floris Winkle have basically asked the same question in different words, so I'm going to kind of combine them horribly. So your point is about important aspects of of science, money, motivation, infrastructure being more pronounced in Antarctica. And that's great. But to what extent isn't Antarctica really a case apart in the global context, even including the Arctic ? And I'm going to just jump back to what Lisa added to that, which is could the same be said of the history of science in space? I guess that's outer space. And in both of these kind of questions come around to what can these international spaces really tell us, if anything, about the global history of science, if such a thing is possible as a global history of science? So I throw quite a lot at you there, Peter, but if you can be really succinct, that'd be great.
I'll do my best. Brilliant questions. I agree completely about space. And I think space is particularly important because there was this very powerful rhetoric about the good of humankind and the advancement of scientific frontiers. Sputnik comes out of the International Geophysical Year as well. Science as a means of articulating political strength, I think we see much the same dynamics there, and I agree completely. In fact, probably more so, that the resources that have to be marshalled and the political capital that has to be marshalled, they make space, I think, possibly an even better example than Antarctica in that regard. The bigger question about the global context, does Antarctica demand its own history of science, kind of history of science? I feel no. And I feel that part of the argument I want to make is that Antarctica can bring into relief some trends, some dynamics that in fact are more pervasive than we sometimes think. Just because it's the continent for science doesn't mean that science operates in a fundamentally different way down there. It's more pronounced. And in fact, if we take critically this idea, but what happens if we think it's all about science, then we realize, well, actually, it's not all about science. Science becomes that when science is the only way that you can do politics, well, politics gets done through science. It's not that no politics gets done. So in that case, I don't think there is anything particularly special about Antarctica. I think it exemplifies some underlying dynamics better than other places. And I think because there's this disjuncture that I'd like to argue that there is between the continent for science and peace and the permeation of Antarctic science by political goals, I think that can pose some questions about the way scientific networks are constructed in order to enact political goals. So Antarctica, I think, is not the only place where these dynamics happen, but it's a particularly good place to look at them. And I think Lisa is right. Space is possibly an even better place to look for them in other ways.
We've got like no time, so I'm going to actually just not let Leo come in on that. I'm going to go to the final question because I run the tech, so I can let us go over, and it's my fault. You three of you have opened up some really interesting conversations that I hope we take forward into the next Congress in 2025. But I wanted to pick up on Melanie Frappier's kind of question, which is, and I'll preface this by saying the DHST lingua franca might have become English, but technically the DHST has 7 official languages. So there was no requirement to present in English, technically. So everyone just chose to, which is different. And I remember my first Congress 10 years ago, and there were panels in Russian, French, Spanish, and Chinese. So, whereas in the last few iterations, that's not been the case. The question is, how should we organize a conference like this one to support such a conference? I think she means a multi-language conference that was being suggested by the first paper, if we want to avoid the trappings and blindfolds of using English as the lingua franca. So how can we, anyone have any suggestions for how we might organize better conferences, more than just publications? I know you all talked about publications, but I think that's just one of the things that we do. Anyone want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's just being more plural. I mean, you hear different talks. You can ask them to use the slides in English if they are talking in a different language than English. Trying to find solutions. Obviously, we cannot have interpreters in every room, but then there will be jobs for interpreters. So I think it's a change of culture, and obviously, lingua francas have many advantages. I mean, this is something obvious, no? But it's just trying to change the culture, because there is an asymmetry, and there is certain people is out of it. And mastering languages is not something just elitist, no? I mean, Gordon, when you talk about cosmopolitanism, I think it is very interesting, but sometimes I tend to think cosmopolitanism is something, a bit aristocratic. But I don't know if you live in large cities, but in any large cities today, there are people that speak many languages, maybe 50 languages, and we don't know about them. I mean, maybe they don't study history of science. They are in the suburbs, in the periphery. They are immigrants, but there are people from anywhere in the world, and there is an option there to learn many languages. No, I don't know.
Yeah, Gordon?
Yeah, I was at a conference a short while ago where there was something like 30 translations, and it was just indigenous knowledge and ecology, and they required it. It was a bit chaotic. It's possible that artificial intelligence is going to be the site of this kind of thing, simultaneous translation into whatever. And you could just run anybody in their indigenous language and something comes up on the screen. Things are moving very fast. I'm not sure if that's the best solution, but it might be a direction.
Peter?
Just very quickly, I think there's an interesting distinction to be made between using a language in a vehicular sense, so in order that we can all understand each other, or that this is the language I choose because I can express myself in a way that I otherwise couldn't. And my opinion on this is starting to change. I was, for a long time, an advocate of the vehicular model. I taught in France English as a vehicular language for science, and I thought that was a crucial thing to do. Still think that's important. I'm starting to come round to the position that a vehicular language still has inequalities written into it. The fact that there are a lot of native English speakers in the world, and there are a great many people for whom English is functionally an equal 1A language rather than being a distinct second language, doesn't obscure the fact that if your first language is Spanish and you're in Argentina, your first language is Indonesian and you're in Indonesia, Japan, Japanese, you can express yourself in a way that not only you're more comfortable with, but you may feel able to do things that you can't otherwise, apart from that issue of respect as well. If you're Japanese and you do all your business in English, does that mean that you have reconciled yourself to the fact that your language is not an equal language when it comes to scientific communication? I don't really know what the answer is there, but I'm wondering if we can do both. Can we have vehicular languages that enable us all to function in a common space, but at the same time have a greater recognition that we should all try and learn at least one other language too, and that it should become more accepted that publication in a non-vehicular manner can be possible too.
Thanks, Peter. I think that's an excellent saber-rattling note to end on. I'll just add that my favorite day in my career was being able to run a conference in the UNESCO chambers for a day and everyone speak in their own language they were comfortable with. And we got business transacted much quicker and everyone felt that they understood each other much better. And we'd spent 4 years meeting and trying to converse in English beforehand and it just didn't work. And as soon as everyone was able to speak in the language they were most comfortable with, business got transacted much quicker. So I know it's expensive, but I think we need to find ways of enabling it. And I would direct anyone who's interested, a paper in panel 2 was delivered in both English and Maori. So there are ways of doing this. We just need to be more sensitive and try harder, as we all will do. So we are over time, and I will shout at myself later. Thank you once again to our 3 excellent speakers. Thank you to all of you who've attended and stuck with us as we've just gone slightly over time. There is another session now, if you've still not had enough yet, and there is a meeting to discuss a bit of business after that, and then we're done. But if you've missed anything, you should be able to catch the recordings back on Zoom for the next 5 days and on the BSHS YouTube channel beyond that. So thank you very much, and stay safe wherever you are, and good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Bye.
Future of food. And so from Arctic to the Sahara, they are telling us stories of success that for thousands of years with indigenous, traditional, horticultural, and farming knowledge. Okay, they provide a bunch of examples that we should follow. But when we talk about here indigenous knowledge, we can also more or less say that this is about traditional knowledge. This is about historical knowledge, okay? It's always the same. Again, now I'm telling you about a project, an ERC grant here in Portugal at the University of Coimbra by one of our colleagues, Dulce Freire. And also the big challenge of this project is the same. So humanity is facing a huge challenge, how to feed a growing population in a sustainable way. And they are providing answers by rescuing seeds that were totally forgotten, okay? And so Reseed promotes strategies for a win-win environmental society outcomes. I've seen in many other sessions that this is a big topic nowadays, which is the relationship between the history of science and technology and environmental history. So here is one project that is in fact tackling with that relationship. So linking edible seeds to places and to innovations needed for food production. This is crucial to better understand how historical experience can contribute to create solutions that ensure sustainable futures. And in fact, they have rescued some seeds, okay, from they were totally forgotten, and now they are rescuing them. Now, this is a former project that I had, Sustainable Beauty for Algarvian Gardens, Hold Knowledge for a Better Future. Well, I'm not going to describe the project nor talk about many things that were discovered here. Just to say that one thing again that has impact on environment. So we have discovered that these are the top 7 trees that prevailed in the Algarve landscape. But nowadays, this is nobody knows about this. They think that the figs is like a novelty, and now everybody talks about the Algarve orange. Okay, and so how this is something that is that we've been researching. So how the lack of historical knowledge led to an environmental problem in the Algarve. The fact that we think now it was a political construction. It has nothing to do with history, that the oranges were prevailing in the Algarve when in fact it was a fig landscape. So, and as the citrus require much more water than the figs that are rain-fed, this is leading not only this, but with many other problems, especially the tourist industry and golf camps. But in fact, this is also adding to more problems regarding hydric resources. And so I argue that in fact, the Algarve should be green, a fig landscape, and not an orange landscape. This is what it was naturally. Okay, now going to the other side of the coin, which is water. Always when we talk about farming or gardening or horticulture or agriculture, water is the big issue. And so even the United Nations are also claiming for nature-based solutions for water management. And so also if we read these reports, we know nowadays much more, because we know about much more projects that are more or less claiming for the same things and discovering the same things, how history of scientific technology can in fact contribute for this. Okay, so for example, this is the Aqua project, which I coordinated for the past 4 years. And here with hydraulic engineer, we discovered that in fact, the consumption of water in historic gardens is lower than in contemporary gardens. And this is almost difficult to believe, as we have in contemporary gardens, we have a micro irrigation, sprinkler irrigation. We even use the water sense, which is a smart system, the most advanced that can be used in irrigation. However, and the data now it's mathematics that is saying it, the consumption at the historical gardens of Queluz is lower than in contemporary gardens. And we have here 2 examples in Lisbon and in Algarve. And why? Well, it's easy to see by these pictures that they are covered with lawns in a Mediterranean country. So there is they require so much water. And on the other side, the Palace of Queluz only has trees and shrubs. So they are rain-fed. So in fact, the water that circulated in Queluz, it's not for irrigation, it's for water jets and water games. So again, we have made, again, with hydraulic engineers, this multidisciplinary research where we have accessed the hydric